All right, now the responses are coming. There we go. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. I believe you guys can see the results and see that it looks like we're mostly split between college university faculty and several course design specialists. People have...
Sorry, can't see the results.
You can't. Okay, I shared them. Oh, oops. I'm trying to share them.
There we go.
Okay, so I'm going to let you guys take a look at those, and I'm going to keep on moving forward. So there we go. Thank you for taking the time to answer that poll multiple times. Now that we know a little bit more about who's here, we next wanted to share our experiences and lessons learned in adapting a hands-on group-based lab course to an online asynchronous format. And by the way, I'm just going to ask if you could hold your questions to the end or put them in the chat, that would be helpful. All right, whoops. There we go. So why adapt the course? The physiology lab course that we're going to be talking about is required of all integrated physiology majors, and it's also taken by a large number of non-majors who are interested in careers in healthcare. The Department of Integrated Physiology and Continuing Education wanted a dedicated online asynchronous physiology lab for the CU Complete program. And if you're not familiar with that program, CU Complete is a collaboration between departments in continuing education to provide an online option for students to be able to complete a major. Why myself and Francoise? Why did we adapt the course? I was responsible for developing the in-person physiology lab, and I've taught it many, many times. So I knew the course very, very well, and also the student faculty experience, the goals of the course, etc. I also have extensive experience with active learning and development of course and departmental learning goals and objectives. Francoise has science education background and extensive online teaching experience in physiology. She's also a Quality Matters online course reviewer. And because she is with the continuing education department, she is supported by a learning design specialist. So together our skill sets aligned. We had familiarity with both the course and online teaching practices. Fortunately, we also had prior experience working together, and we knew that we had a similar pedagogical approach, and that we could both let go of our egos and focus on creating the best possible learning experience for students in the course. Before we dive into adapting the course, I thought it'd be beneficial to talk a little bit more about the in-person course. This course had been developed and refined over several years by myself and several other science education experts in integrated physiology to accomplish specific learning goals meant to build on and enhance experiences from the lecture courses. This involved developing some pre-post tests to help us assess learning outcomes and use that data then to refine the course over multiple semesters. The overarching knowledge or skills that we hope students leave the course with include applying physiological knowledge from the prerequisite lecture course, applying statistics from the prerequisite statistics course, and also applying the scientific method, including creating hypotheses, analyzing and interpreting data, and drawing conclusions. So some key in-person aspects of the course: it's inquiry-based, although it starts more guided and it builds throughout the semester as the student's skills improve over time. It involves hands-on data collection, it's group-based, and it includes 9 labs with 2 exams that have practical questions, practical hands-on questions, and culminates with a final multi-week group project. The in-person lab also utilizes both free software as well as expensive proprietary software hardware. So we utilize both Excel and our Studio, which is a statistics program that's used in the prerequisite course. Both of those are free, but we also utilize a Power Lab hardware and lab chart software system for data collection analysis. And that's expensive and much too expensive for at-home use. So as we began discussing adapting the course to an online format, we started by identifying our key goals, which included keeping the learning goals and the inquiry-based nature of the lab, keeping the group work and assignments and the final group project, and then as best as possible, recreating the interactiveness of the in-person experience and the hands-on learning component. Some other things that we had to take into consideration was that the course would be taught by multiple instructors. And so we started with a common course template for all the instructors, and then following universal course design principles and best practices in online course design. So when we actually started planning out the course, we began by asking ourselves some bigger picture questions. So in addition to the ones I just mentioned relating to the goals that I've got at the top here italicized, we also spent some time discussing how could we adapt a 4-hour per week in-person lab to an online asynchronous schedule. Due to time and technological considerations, could we keep all the labs? How could students collect data and analyze it at home? What equipment or software would they need? And how would they get any lab supplies that they needed? And then also how to adapt exams to keep the practical questions when the exams are going to be in an online format. So we won't have time to go into quite all of those today, but feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Our emails are going to be at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. All right, so as a result of all of this discussion, Franny and I identified 4 main issues that we needed to solve. And at this point, I'm going to hand things over to Françoise, and she's going to talk about each of these in turn.
One second. Is everybody able to see the screen? Janet, are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, Janet.
You're
Okay,
welcome.
so as we considered these questions and goals that we had for the course, and as we prepared the presentation, it became clear that there were kind of 4 main categories that we wanted to address as we created this asynchronous course. And one was, how are we going to handle interaction between student and faculty and student-student interaction? How are we going to manage group work, scheduling of the labs, both weekly labs and then over the course of the semester, and handling any of our technology and equipment needs? So we're going to begin with interaction, looking at our student-faculty interaction. And to give a picture, you can imagine that in the in-person lab, there'd be a TA or a faculty member present, being able to guide the students and answer questions when additional guidance was needed. And we know in online practices that it's important to have that regular faculty component. So we wanted to ensure that this was present for the students. And so some methods that we used to create this were in the beginning, the first week, to have people introductions, doing both faculty and student introductions. They were given some prompts and asked to create a video that they posted to a course discussion board. This aided in building community and getting a sense of who was in the class, what their interests and background were. Giving course orientation and tours, helping students to understand where to find everything and what the course expectations and the faculty expectations were at the beginning of the course, as well as ensuring that in each of the labs, the faculty member created a short video introducing the weekly lab, aiding in that regular faculty presence. And weekly, the faculty member created lab lectures and tutorials, so the students had the faculty voice there, as well as being available regularly by email, Monday through Friday, trying to get back within the day, but required within 48 hours. And then for the group project, ensuring that we coordinated planning such that students had regular feedback as they prepared their presentation over the course of that time period. We use Canvas here at CU. And so if you use another platform, I will reference Canvas particularly in the talk, but I also try to be sensitive to what technologies other faculty may have access to. So in terms of turning in assignments, we use the technology specifically for feedback, making sure that students could view their responses, as well as providing some built-in feedback. So during the time period that we'll show later, where students were turning in their own work, they could have immediate feedback with a faculty voice in those assignments. In addition, we provided video feedback created by each of us teaching the course. Using Canvas Studio, you could also use PlayPosit, Kaltura, or Zoom to record some video feedback. But one of the nice things about Canvas Studio and PlayPosit is it allows for some active learning questions to be embedded in your lectures or tutorials, prompting students along the way. And that's what I show here in this lower video, myself giving a presentation to the students. And then I've interjected some poll questions. And in the end, I'm able to see after the due date what the results are. And if there is something that stands out as a common misunderstanding based on the results, I can then email the students prior to the end of the lab week some guidance on that topic. Other useful technology for providing feedback are document cameras or tablets and stylus. I often like to draw out equations or physiological mechanisms as I provide feedback. And so these tools can be helpful, especially in a lab class, if you need to show students how to use the piece of technology or equipment, or they need to troubleshoot and send a video back on what they're having a hard time with, and promoting lab skills. So those are the primary ways that we incorporated student-faculty interaction. And now we'll move on to student-student interaction with the emphasis on group work through the discussion board. So we were curious to hear from our audience, what do you think would be the biggest challenges or stumbling blocks for regular group work? So if you could take a moment and post in the chat your response to this, we'd be interested in hearing your voice. And Janet, I'll need some assistance because I'm not able to see the chat right now.
Okay. So comments, students dislike group projects, uneven participation, differing technology issues.
Okay, I think that we'll be able to address some of those for our audience.
Yeah, I think they've hit on some of the big ones.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on. So first, I'd like to talk about our lab write-ups and how we handled that. So that would be the work that they turned in at the conclusion of each lab. So in the in-person course, the design was that there were 4 groups of 4 students, and they turned in a common group lab write-ups. There were no individual lab write-ups in the in-person lab. This encouraged discussion, and it kept the grading load reasonable for the teaching faculty, but it really benefited the students so that we could ensure that they got feedback on that lab in a timely manner to help them improve for the next lab and in preparation for their lab quizzes and exams. So our decision was to keep the group lab write-up format for the online course. So things that we needed to consider was, is this grading load manageable? How are we going to use the technology to grade it? How are we going to have accountability, ensuring that in an asynchronous course that the students were going to both complete the work on their own and contribute equally to the group lab write-up? And how would our learning platform assist us in turning in group work, earning a group grade, but then representing the individual grade in the student's grade book? Our solution came to creating individual and group work. And so what this was in our discussions, it became clear that there were certain goals and objectives that students need to meet to be able to be successful in their group discussion and contributing to that group lab write-up. So we created a period of time where they did work on their own and then came together in another period of time to do group work. So in the individual portion of the course, they completed watching a lab lecture, reading the lab manual, and completing a pre-lab quiz and worksheet covering all of the 3 major goals: experimental methods, statistics, and physiology. And then we built in immediate feedback using some of the technology and methods I described earlier. This then brings us to the individual lab write-up, and this was the true magic of the course. We asked the students to complete an individual lab write-up on their own, which mimicked the group lab write-up. They were the exact same questions, but they had to do it on their own in advance. It was broken up into 2 parts: the hypothesis before they received the data and did any data collection, and then part 2, where they completed the data collection, creating their graphs, doing their analysis and conclusions. They then turned this in to the group discussion board. This was for participation credit and not graded for correctness at all. And we utilized the settings in the group discussion board in Canvas that allowed us to ensure that no other member of the group could see a student's post until they made their own posts. So that ensured that individual work component. This then allowed them to stand on their own 2 feet in the group component of the week's lab. And this was broken into 3 parts. The first part was the group lead. We had an identified group lead, and they identified areas of agreement and disagreement and posted questions to the group. So they looked at all 4 members' lab write-ups, their individual lab write-ups, determined which questions they agreed upon, which they disagreed upon, and they posted all the disagreements into an organized thread in their group discussion board. This then brings us to part 2, where the group comes in. They had a period of time where they entered into the discussion board and had to come to agreement on what they were going to turn in for each question. And then part 3 is the group lead's role, where they use the feedback between their peers to finalize the lab write-up and submit 1 group lab write-up for grade. And they also use this period of time to receive approval from their group on the decisions made for each answer for each question. So how did we hold students accountable? And it's truly the mechanisms of accountability that led to the robust group work and allowed for rich discussions. And so those 3 mechanisms were a rubric, a group contract, and a weekly peer evaluation. So I wanted to give you a sneak peek of the rubric. So if you had not seen one before, you had it in your mind as I talked about it. And what you need to know right now is that on the left are the categories, and across the top is the level of accomplishment. If you're not familiar with a rubric, it's a standardized method of scoring an assignment. And why did we use a rubric? Well, it established expectations early in the course for what was expected in the group discussion. And we used it to communicate timing, quality, and quantity of responses, and to also ensured appropriate involvement by individuals, so the responsibility didn't fall completely on the week's lead. And it also avoided the divide and conquer lab write-up method. And so some of this we heard about in the chat. It ensured robust interaction, and it also facilitated ease of grading and timing of giving feedback to students. If you're interested in creating rubrics, which we don't have enough time to go into the full details of it, we have a link here that we're going to post in the chat that will give you some information and examples for rubrics. The Canvas learning management system has a tool for building out the rubric that we create, and we can attach it to an assignment so that when we score it, a grade is populated and goes into the grade book in its appropriate category. It's also really important that if you choose to use a rubric in your course, that you're very clear to the students in your introductory materials that you have a rubric, what it looks like, where to find it, and also sharing with students once it's been scored where they can view it. So that way, if they didn't receive 100%, they can see which categories they can improve on in the forthcoming week. So I'd like to take you through the categories that we had, because you'll really see how the students were motivated beyond just the fact that it was a collective group lab write-up for a grade to have that rich discussion. So the top 3 rows are individual work, and the remaining rows are group work. The first 3 rows really have to do with timeliness. Did the students contribute their individual lab write-ups part 1 and 2 on time? And did the lead post those disagreements on time? And I should note that if they didn't submit it on time, they still had to submit it because they could receive 0 participation credit if they didn't. And then we move to the group component. Were they timely to their first post, trying to work towards coming to agreement on the disagreements, really trying to get that discussion going on the first day? And then how much did they contribute? Did they contribute to all the questions, 80% of the questions or less? And what are the quality of the comments? Are they adding significantly to the conversation, helping to move towards a final decision? Or is there kind of a lack of clear organization? And then pulling in the knowledge objectives for the course, how much of their physiology, their experimental methods and statistics are they using to support their reasoning? Are they using examples from their resources, or are their responses vague? And then lastly, we included a section on grammar and respect. We wanted it to be a safe space to have discourse. And also we wanted to promote professional communication. We know that a lot of students get very comfortable with their text message language, and we wanted to avoid that and help them move towards being able to communicate well in their postgraduate work. This slide is to show you the instructor grading experience. So on the left, we have a single student's set of responses to the overall group discussion, and it shows the time, date, and stamp. And on the right is the rubric that I can actively select the appropriate accomplishment to score that student. So if we were in Canvas right now, I would be in something called Speed Grader, which populates for each student all of the work that they contributed to the discussion board. And I would be scrolling through this. This gets to be longer with all of their responses. And I can quickly go through the rubric and click, did they turn things in on time based on the time stamp or not? What was the level of their comment? So it was quick to score and enter, and it automatically entered into the gradebook. The second method that we employed for accountability was a group contract. So in the first week of class, we had a Google survey for students using the Google Forms technology on what were their preferred labs to lead. So in their course calendar in the syllabus, they had access to the 8 labs that they would be doing in the semester, along with the schedule. And so they could pick this based on their interest in a lab or their schedule, but they picked 3. And this then allowed ourselves as faculty to organize groups in a way that allowed these group members to at least get 1 or 2 of their labs as their top 3. So we then made the groups from this, created the group. We used the people setting in Canvas to group the students into groups of 4, and then asked students to create a group contract. And this group contract was to make the expectations of group participation explicit and agreed upon in advance. They needed to include a statement from the group about their plan for participation, what should happen if a member doesn't fully participate, and the option to turn in your own work for grade was not an option. That would be a 0 because this was a group lab, a course where we were submitting a group lab write-ups. They kind of had to have a keep the group going mentality in their group contract. And ultimately, this was to try to avoid any mid-semester divorces or end of semester built up frustration. So on the right, we share with you what our group contract looked like. It was fairly simple. They listed their group members. They put in the agreed upon schedule that the faculty member created. If they needed to swap one out, this was a place for them to do it, but this was their finalized schedule. And then it had their statement about what participation means and what they would agree upon if there was lack of participation. The third method that we employed for accountability were peer evaluations. So these allow students to confidentially evaluate group members' participation weekly. They turned them in at the end of the group work period. It gave students a mechanism to be heard, and it allowed instructors to gain a weekly pulse and sense of group interactions, allowing us to intercede if necessary before issues became too dire. And student scores could be adjusted, and I'll explain that in a moment. So on the right, we share our peer evaluation. And the important pieces are to note are that only the instructor ever saw this. So it was peer to instructor, never peer to peer. And what they did was they listed their 4 lab mates' names, and they were given 100% to divide among their peers based on participation. So if everybody worked equivalently in the group discussion board to creating that group lab write-up, then you would give the student a score of 25%. If for some reason somebody felt that their lab mate was participating less, then they would drop that score below 25% and adjust everybody else's scores appropriately. If 2 students or more in the group shared that one student or 2 students, didn't matter, participated less, then it was an opportunity for the instructors to take a look at why. Now, students did have to provide an explanation if they gave a student less than 25% participation so that the instructor could understand. And this ultimately allowed for us as instructors to either see, was this maybe, did we need to help the person with the observation of the lack of participation? Maybe they tend to dominate the group and they don't know how to bring other people's voices in. Or was it that the person really didn't participate? And then we could go to both groups and kind of get their own observations and pictures and find out, well, maybe this person had something come up, or maybe the person didn't truly understand what participation involves. And then we could have an objective conversation about this early and allow for the group to continue to work successfully throughout the semester. So ultimately, all of this brings us to how did we build this individual and group discussion into a weekly schedule for the semester? So we needed to identify what that regular schedule was going to look like. And this took a lot of discussion. We needed to allow for flexibility, as we know that online students take these courses because their schedules don't always fit into a main campus schedule. They might need to work more on the weekend versus the weekday, or the weekday versus the weekend. They may need to work at night. They may need to work at the day based on their individual needs. We also need to allow sufficient time for that group discussion, at least 48 hours, to allow for these multiple responses, as it wasn't as simple as, here's a post, respond to one person. This had layers, sometimes 14 questions that they were responding to get into that deep discussion, and they did. We also wanted it to be a consistent, repeated schedule so that they had that habit weekly of when they needed to be online participating in that group discussion. And then we also needed to be sensitive that it was a 2-credit lab class and that the time on task was appropriate for the credit hours. So first we figured out how much time was needed for group work, and we landed on 4 days. 1 day for the group lead for their disagreements and posting that, 2 days for the group to interact in the discussion board, and 1 day for the lead to finalize and submit the group lab write-up. So working backwards, because we wanted to work within a week format, that allowed for 3 days for the individual work I mentioned earlier. And this was nice because 7 days was repeatable. So ultimately, what did that look like to the students? We made sure that we had a clear visual of this in the introductory week so that students had a checklist and knew in advance, so there were no hiccups going into the first lab. So what they saw here was that the first 3 days we had individual work, and the last 4 days they had group work, and we did our best to try to offer some weekend opportunity for students who needed that flexibility. And they could then use this as a checklist throughout the week, and this was repeated through every lab and the group project. And so ultimately, this allows us to build out the semester schedule. So the online course at CU is a 14-week semester compared to 15 weeks in the main campus. And we ultimately ended up with 13 teaching weeks. Rather than a 4-hour dedicated lab, we spread it out over the week. And we began the lab in the second week in something that we could title the Getting Ready Week, which is an onboarding week. We ended up with 8 labs total rather than 9. We were able to keep both exams and the practical questions. And we built in some preparatory time to allow students to practice their statistics, their Excel skills, and some of their lab analysis skills prior to entering into a lab where it was for a grade. And then we spread the group project out over 6 weeks. So ultimately what was unique to the online lab course was this getting ready week, this onboarding week, where we had the course orientation and tours, the welcome assignments, syllabus and syllabus quiz, ensuring they could log into our statistical program, that we coordinated that lab lead survey and got the groups and the group contract all set up so that we were ready to go with our expectations working well with Lab 1. We did give up one lab both because we had 1 week less of teaching time and that we were unable to have one of the labs collect data at home. And we added to the course an exam week where we built in that preparatory practice time, as well as that individual lab write-up component. And then lastly, we found in the online course that we needed to bring in the lab project far earlier so that there was time for faculty feedback and group decisions on what their group project was going to be. And ultimately, this is what it looked like. 15 weeks in the in-person, and for the online class, dropping that week. Here are the 4 labs and an exam with the prep time, another 4 labs beginning the project prep time, culminating in the project presentation. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Janet.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the other issue we had to consider was the data collection and analysis. The in-person lab, oops, there we go. The in-person lab, students have access to all the equipment that they're going to need in the lab, and they complete everything in the lab. And that includes the Power Lab hardware and lab chart software for the data collection analysis, other lab supplies that they might need for data collection in various weeks, the RStudio statistics program, and the Excel graphing or Excel for graphing. We wanted to keep the data collection analysis experience, but as I previously mentioned, the hardware and software for data collection and analysis is expensive, way too expensive for at-home use. The statistics program, while free, can be tricky to install on personal computers. And we wanted faculty spending their time on teaching, not resolving tech issues. And another consideration is that there would be multiple faculty teaching the course who had varied experiences with the statistical program and may or may not be able to help students with any tech issues they might have. The other thing was that some of the lab supplies are easily available and some were not. So we couldn't do things exactly the same way that we would do in the in-person lab, surprise, surprise. So we had to figure out how we could replicate the overall experience. And that required some adaptation and getting just a little bit creative. We had to ask ourselves, what were alternatives that were reasonable, affordable, and things that could be acquired or accessed anywhere in the world. So ultimately, we came up with a blended approach to kind of recreate that overall experience. First, we had students purchase certain equipment, and that allowed them to do some data collection on themselves for each lab. They could either purchase a prepackaged equipment kit from the bookstore. That included an automated blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter for measuring heart rate and blood oxygen levels, a blood typing kit, and a glucometer for measuring blood glucose levels. And the bookstore prepackaged those and they would mail them to students. And the total cost was around $120. So kind of equivalent to the cost for a textbook. Or if students already had some of that equipment, and many of our students often do, they could purchase individual components through either Amazon, local pharmacy, or some other source. The second thing we had students do is analyze pre-recorded data from a subject. So we found that there was a free version of the proprietary software called Lab Chart Reader. And this program allows analysis of data, but not data collection. So we went in and pre-recorded some data that students could then analyze themselves. And fortunately, this software was very easily installed on a Mac or PC. So that meant that students were having a similar data analysis experience as students in the in-person lab and could practice that skill. And the third thing is students were able to analyze previously recorded data sets that provided them data for larger samples for statistical analysis and graphing. Ultimately, we were fortunate that we found that our studio, the statistical program, could be hosted through the university's Research Computing Jupyter Hub platform. This was accessible to students just by using their CU login. And this option was a wonderful discovery that we heard about from a learning design specialist that made our lives so much easier and made the student learning experience much more seamless and straightforward. So our key takeaways for you. Consider, do you need to do things the same as for the in-person class, or can you streamline or modify things? And ways to help you identify that are to look at your key learning objectives or goals for the course, and that can help you identify what must say, what can go. Do you need to do it all, and could you do it differently? Consider how you'll incorporate group and individual work, including accountability, scheduling, and grading both mechanism, for example, rubrics, and load. One of the unexpected benefits that we found at the conclusion of the course is that by having students do individual work before the group work, it made students more accountable. They couldn't use the divide and conquer method that they always use in the in-person labs. And that meant that the online students actually got more individual practice and were more familiar with some of the techniques than sometimes the in-person students are. Consider how you deliver content and feedback. Carefully plan your schedule and have a consistent, repeatable structure, recognizing that online students need a more flexible schedule, and clearly communicate that schedule to students and orient them. Identify a support network and find resources to support you. For example, specialists, learning management for the learning management system, universal design, online course design, and look at other courses in other departments. For example, I first thought about the option of using an equipment kit after hearing that our chemistry department was doing that for their online chemistry labs, and that got the wheels turning for me. Consider technologies or equipment needs, and if you can keep them or if you need an alternative, be mindful of costs and be mindful of time for students to download technology and orient to it. Franny mentioned we have built in some onboarding time to help students learn that technology in advance of doing the labs. Also consider, are you going to need to provide tech support to students? And crucial, you got to have good instructions and documentation for students, walking them through step by step how they're going to access that technology or the software, how to use it, and what to do if things go wrong. And then finally, any online course, you can't over communicate with students. Okay, I think we have a little bit of time. What I was going to do is create some breakout rooms, and I posted 2 Google Doc links in the chat. We're going to have 2 different types of breakout rooms. Odd number rooms will be for anyone interested in talking about online course conversion or creation, and even numbered rooms will be available for discussing group work. And I'm going to create some breakout rooms now, and that should have popped up for you to be able to join a breakout room. And you just need to click join either for an even number room or an odd number room. And here are our emails. It's first.last@colorado.edu. And Franny and I will float between the rooms. You can raise your hand and let us know if you have questions. If not, thank you very much. And I need to open the rooms. All right, there we go. Or if you have questions, we can hang out and answer any questions. So Franny, I see one person in room 2 who's all by herself.
I can't move into a room.
Oh.
No, I got it to work. I got it to work.
Okay. And I will hang out here if anybody has any questions. And Franny, oh, okay. I moved on, there was one person in room 10, so I moved him into room 2. You're muted.
The even rooms, are they group work or?
Even rooms are group work.
Okay.
Yeah. Danielle or Connor, did you have any questions?
Hey, Janet, you're on
Okay,
mute.
I think we can probably stop the recording.